Imagine waking up on Christmas morning and 5 of your children are gone. No bodies, no goodbye, no answers, just ash. And a question that would haunt an entire family for the rest of their lives. Were they taken or did they burn? This is the story of the Sodder children. And almost 80 years later, nobody knows what really happened that night. It's Christmas Eve, 1945. The war is finally over. Across America, families are celebrating, laughing, wrapping presents for their kids. In Fayetteville, West Virginia, a small coal mining town tucked into the Appalachian Mountains, the Sodder family is doing the same. George Sodder, a man who had come to America from Sardinia, Italy, at the age of 13, with nothing but ambition, had built himself a life, a trucking company, a house, and a family of 10 children with his wife Jenny. That Christmas Eve, 9 of those children were home. The oldest son, Joe, was away serving in the military. The night started like any other Christmas Eve. The younger kids stayed up late, excited and full of energy. The oldest daughter, Marion, 19 years old, sat with 5 of her siblings on the ground floor while their parents went to bed. At some point, Marion fell asleep on the couch. At around 12:30 in the morning, Jenny woke up to the sound of the telephone ringing. She got up, went downstairs, answered it. The voice on the other end was a woman she didn't recognize, laughing, asking for someone who didn't live there. Jenny hung up, and as she turned around, she noticed something strange. The lights downstairs were still on. The curtains were open. She went back to bed. 30 minutes later, she smelled smoke. By the time Jenny reached the stairs, the entire office area of the house was already in flames. She screamed for George. She screamed for the children. In the chaos, George and Jenny managed to get out with 4 of their kids: Marion, John, George Jr., and little 2-year-old Sylvia. But the other 5 were nowhere to be found. Morris, 14 years old. Martha, 12. Louis, 9. Jenny, 8. And Betty, 5 years old. George went back in. Twice, 3 times, he tried to pull down a ladder from the side of the house to reach the upper windows, but the ladder was gone. He ran to his truck to drive it under the windows so the kids could jump down, but the engine wouldn't start. Not that night of all nights. George stood outside in the freezing December air, watching his house burn, screaming names into the smoke. No answer came. The fire department was only 2.5 miles away. But the trucks didn't arrive until 8 o'clock in the morning, 7 hours after the fire had started. By then there was nothing left, just a basement full of ash and debris. 7 hours. The official explanation was that there had been a miscommunication, that the call never went through properly, that it was just an unfortunate delay. But for George Sodder, nothing about that night was just unfortunate. The next morning, investigators arrived and conducted what can only be described as a cursory search. They found almost nothing: a few bone fragments, no full skeletons, no clear evidence that 5 children had died in that fire. The fire chief declared the blaze had been accidental, caused by faulty Christmas lights wiring. The children, he said, had certainly perished. The fire had been hot enough to completely incinerate their bodies. Case closed. Death certificates issued before the year was out. But George Sodder had recently had the house rewired and inspected. He didn't believe it for a second, and then the details started to surface. Details that made the official story fall apart completely. The phone line, investigators later discovered, had not burned in the fire. It had been cut, cleanly, from the outside. The missing ladder George had been looking for that night. It was found days later, hidden under an embankment 23 meters away from the house. And here is perhaps the most disturbing fact of all. A researcher later compared the Sodder fire to a similar house fire from the same period. One that also burned for roughly the same amount of time, also destroyed a home completely. In that fire, despite the heat and duration, they still found the full skeletal remains of the victims. As one forensic researcher put it, bones don't simply vanish in a fire. Even at extreme temperatures, it takes sustained, controlled conditions to destroy bone completely. A house fire lasting less than an hour simply cannot do that. So if there were no bones, where were the children? This is where the story takes a turn that most people don't know about. In the months before the fire, George Sodder had made an enemy. George was a proud man with strong opinions. And in the years following World War II, he was very vocal about his views on the fascist government of his native Italy, specifically his deep opposition to Benito Mussolini. One day, an insurance salesman came to the house. George declined to buy a policy. The man left, but not before turning to George with a warning. He told him that his house would burn down and that his children would be destroyed. George reported it. Nothing happened. Then, the fire came. And when investigators convened the inquest to determine the cause of that fire, George recognized one of the jurors sitting across the table from him. It was the same insurance salesman, the same man who had threatened him, sitting on the jury that would declare the fire accidental. Later, a private investigator named C.C. Tinsley dug deeper and discovered something even more troubling. That insurance salesman had previously worked for George, and before the fire, without George or Jenny's knowledge or consent, he had quietly increased the value of their home insurance policy. Someone, it seemed, had been preparing. George and Jenny never accepted their children were dead, not for a single day. They hired private detectives. They printed thousands of flyers. They wrote letters to the FBI and received a reply personally from J. Edgar Hoover himself, who said regrettably that the case fell outside federal jurisdiction. In 1952, they did something that would make their grief visible to an entire region. They built a billboard right along Route 16 on the site where their house had stood. A large sign with photographs of all 5 children, their names, their ages, and a reward of $5,000, later doubled to $10,000, for anyone who could bring information. For decades, anyone driving through Fayetteville could see those 5 dark-eyed children staring back at them from the roadside. Sightings came in. A woman at a hotel in Charleston said she had seen the children a week after the fire, traveling with adults she didn't recognize. Another witness said she had spotted them being driven away from the burning house in a car that sped off into the night. None of the leads ever went anywhere. In 1967, 22 years after the fire, Jenny received an envelope in the mail. Inside was a photograph of a young man in his 20s, no return address, postmarked from Kentucky. The man in the photo looked unmistakably like what Louis Sodder might have grown up to look like. To this day, that man has never been identified. Years after the fire, a new detail emerged that shook the Sodder family to the core. The fire chief, it turned out, had not been entirely honest. He had told someone, not the family, not the investigators, that he had actually recovered a human body part from the rubble. And instead of reporting it, instead of notifying George and Jenny, he had quietly buried it in a box near the site. When the family found out, they demanded to know where the box was. The fire chief took them to the spot. They dug it up. Inside the box was a beef liver, not human remains. A beef liver buried in the ruins of a house that had burned to the ground. No explanation was ever given for how it got there. No one was ever held accountable for the deception. George Sodder died in 1969, having spent the last 24 years of his life searching for answers that never came. Jenny kept the billboard standing until she died in 1989. Their youngest daughter, Sylvia, the 2-year-old who had been carried out of the burning house that Christmas morning, spent her entire adult life continuing her parents' search. She passed away in 2021 at 79 years old, without ever knowing the truth about what happened to her brothers and sisters. The case was officially declared closed by West Virginia authorities, who told the family the search was, quote, hopeless. Most investigators who have studied the case believe the children likely perished in the fire, that the absence of remains can be explained by the length and intensity of the blaze and by the incomplete search conducted the following morning. But the phone line that was cut, not burned, the ladder that was hidden 23 meters away, the threats made weeks before, the conflicted juror, the liver in a box, the photograph postmarked from Kentucky. Weirdness, as one journalist put it, does not necessarily equal murder. But it doesn't equal nothing either. 5 children, Christmas Eve, 1945, gone. And the billboard stood for 40 years, asking a question that nobody ever answered. What was their fate? Kidnapped, murdered, or are they still alive? This is Dark Records. I'll see you in the next case.